Hello and welcome back. This is our third session of I Decide for Me, Let's Talk About It, the parent webinar series sponsored by Clarity. I'm Lori Kuykendall and I'm glad to be with you again this evening. Our third session we'll call Rock the Talk, talking with your kids about sex. The talk, of course, as we've known it through the years, talking about the birds and the bees or talking about sex itself is much more than the talk. And as you'll hear me say throughout the session, it is multiple talks, many talks, rocking as in doing it well with confidence and connecting well with your child on this topic. This is not an easy topic. I know that. Our goal will stay the same as we seek to empower you to guide and support your children toward optimal sexual health by equipping and encouraging you, and on this specific topic about sex, to do that more effectively, more confidently, and more courageously. So let's do it. As I go to say talking about sex, some of us kind of do like the turtle and put our head back in our shell and want to just kind of hide from this reality of talking with our kids about sex. Some of us are like the ostrich that want to bury our heads in the sands and sort of avoid what's really going on. I want to talk about the ostrich and that whole burying your head in the sand thing. Well, it is a euphemism for an expression of sort of avoiding reality. I'll just bury my head in the sand. And it's said about the ostrich who does that same thing. However, if you really research ostriches, you find out that when their head is in the sand, they're protecting their children. They're checking on their children down in there in their nest. Their nest is down in the sand. And it made me think about that I would like to be that kind of parent. If it means putting my head in the sand means protecting my children, well, of course that. But then also that ostriches can, like in this picture, raise up and take on the force of a lion or other dangerous threat that's coming towards those little ones in the nest. And I can relate to that as well. I would like to be that kind of parent that can rise up with courage and confidence to protect my children against the threats. And on this particular topic, the threats of our sexually saturated world, of all the pressure and misinformation and dangerous outcomes of sex all around us, really watch them come up on the screen one at a time. The threats in our sex-saturated world around abortion and abuse and adultery, divorce, exploitation, sexual exploitation, non-marital family formation, you can see them all on the screen as they come up. There are a lot of threats around sex to the current and future health of our children. And my message for sure would be one of encouragement where I would say, you can do this. But it's going to be more than that. On this particular subject, I'm going to add that you must do this. That is upon us as parents, the ones who love and care for our kids the most, to talk about this particular topic, to protect them from the many things that would like to harm their current and future health. The next slide has a picture of the book my mom used on the talk with me in probably around 1980, the Where Did I Come From book. I still have it on my bookshelf. It's tattered and torn. The pages are yellow, and it's really quite hilarious. The pictures and drawings of this little book on puberty and adolescence. Why I bring this book up is because I realize that I'm asking us to do, today's parents, to do something that many of our parents did not do for us. If I asked you how many of your parents talked to you about sex, probably very few of you would say mine did. And if they did, it was probably an awkward conversation. Very few of us had this done well for us. And yet I'm asking you to do it well for your children in today's ages of adolescence coming through the years. So asking you to do something that wasn't done for you can also be hindered by asking you to do something that you may have had some mistakes or regret in your own life on this topic. I'm just going to tell you, we've got to put the past beside and look ahead at what's best for our kids going forward for their health and do something different. Like many areas of our life, we're asking our children, we're hoping for our children to become more and greater than we were. They can learn from our mistakes. And on this particular topic, we don't have to tell them all the details about what we did or did not do to be able to effectively help them do differently going forward. So I wanted to say that up front. As we talk about the talk, I am not talking about an atomic bomb approach, as this picture shows, right? The atom bomb that kind of came in, dropped it all in one awkward moment, and then leave it. No, I'm talking about an ongoing relational conversation on this topic. So here's a picture of a little girl walking up the steps. It is to be a progressive approach from the time they are little till the time they are in adulthood. The next picture shows a little girl holding her mom and dad's hands, and it is to be relational. We are to do it with them. Please don't just buy a book and drop it in front and say, read this. You want to experience and communicate and share about it on an ongoing relational perspective together. Ultimately, with the goal of this last picture of the bride going up those same steps. That there is a future for them. We're driving to their adulthood of helping them prepare now for what will produce the longest and best relationships and family and future going onward. The next slide will show us some results of a survey done asking kids who most influences your decisions about sex. So the barcodes show that for teenagers ages 12 to 15, parents by far are the leading voice around sex, followed behind then by friends and other influences. But look even at 16 to 19 years old. Parents still ahead of friends. They want to hear from us on this topic. They want to know how we feel about this. They want to know what we think is best for their life. We are most influential in their lives. We are more influential than we realize. So we've said throughout this series, our vision is to protect their current and future health physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. And I would say, especially as we talk about sex, all 5 of those dimensions are involved with sex. Sex is not just physical. Sexual decisions affect mental, emotional, relational, and spiritual health as well. So let's talk about some of those risks, what things can happen. Well, certainly one of those is pregnancy. Sex before marriage can lead to teen pregnancy, but I want you to know that pregnancy is not our biggest concern. Pregnancy actually has had a dramatic decline for the last 25 years. Is it still a problem? Absolutely. But I want you to know that pregnancy, birth rates, abortion rates have all been declining for the last 25 years. It's important, though, to help our students know what academic and financial impact might be an outcome of an early pregnancy, and that's for both boys and girls. The mothers and fathers of the children have this kind of impact. And I think it's important that we as families and communities have a compassionate response to those facing an unplanned pregnancy. The choices of abortion or adoption or parenting are all really hard choices. And you can talk about those kinds of outcomes with your children and help them understand the risks, and what you may or may not do with your family may be different than someone else may make in their decisions. But these are all real topics we can talk about compassionately as they are happening around us. But I want you to know pregnancy is not our biggest risk out there. It is one, and we want to be aware of it, but I'm trying to give you a broader picture to talk about and not just worry about pregnancy. I had a good friend who speaks on this topic a lot, and he said his mom's extent of the topic, the conversation with his mom around sex, she came in the kitchen one day and she said, "I'm too young to be a grandparent." And that was kind of all she ever said to him on this topic was, "I'm too young to be a grandparent." There's much more than just pregnancy. I want to share with you, though, as I mentioned, pregnancy, birth, and abortion rates are all declining nationally and have for 25 years. That number also is going down on sexual activity itself. Not everybody's having sex. In fact, for the last 25 years, sexual activity has been going down, and we track it nationally. I'll show you some state data here in just a moment. But I think it's an important message that we help young people understand that most teens are not having sex. Now, does it look that way in the media? No. Does it sound that way in the locker rooms or school buses and the way kids are talking? Not necessarily. Yet I want them to know the information that the majority of young people are not having sex. It is more normal to wait and save sex until later than it is to become sexually active. That number is there as well. Then research was done that showed 71% of teens who have had sex say they wish they would have waited until they were older. Again, with physical and mental and emotional and relational consequences, many of those who have had sex regret it and make a different decision going forward. That's really important as well. Here's some statistics from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. We've mentioned this one before, a national survey. Here's out of Indiana. And I wanted you to see how the number of students who've said they've ever had sexual intercourse has gone down since the data was taken in 2003. You can read through the charts I've got on the screen, and you can see that the majority of them have not had sex. When you compare that to the national statistics as well, again, if you're a numbers person, you can track the numbers on the screen, but I want you to see that a majority of young people have not had sex, and that's across high school as a whole. Our next slide shows those numbers broken down by age group. So you'll see 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. Again, this is in Indiana, asking the question, how many of them have ever had sexual intercourse? Look at that small percentage down in 9th grade, 19.8% have had sex before, said that they have. And then that number goes up. It's not until into the 12th grade year that it flips over to more than half of them having had sex before. I think that's really important when we think about our educational messages and what we're saying and when we're saying it to them. Most of those 12th graders are adults, right? They're 18 years old and may consider different decisions at that time. But what is our message for those youngest kids especially, where by far the majority have not had sex? But look at this question. On the survey, they ask, have you been sexually active in the last 3 months? They call that currently sexually active. That number is much lower even still. And it reflects that idea that some may have had sex before but are not having sex anymore. We like to say in our programs that the information we're sharing will help them make a decision for their future. It's not about their past, what they may have already done, whether it was chosen or even forced upon them. This is a program about the future. You'll hear that in our messaging with you all today, to be focused on what's going forward in a prevention approach, but also in a compassionate approach to those who may have had a different experience along the way. So when we look at pregnancy and we look at sexual activity, those numbers are coming down. What is not coming down is sexually transmitted diseases. So I want to spend some more time talking about this topic. I found that when parents think about sex and their kids, this is not always the top of their mind. Usually it's pregnancy. I want to help you have a broader understanding in the time we have together to look at sexually transmitted disease with the hope that you would go and learn more about this topic for yourself. This is not going down. Begs the question, okay, Lori, you just told us that pregnancy is down and sexual activity is down. Why is sexually transmitted diseases going up? Well, one easy answer to that is that sex is becoming more dangerous. There is more disease among those who are sexually active. Another reason is that students are having sex that is putting them at risk that may not be sexual intercourse as defined by the numbers we were just looking at, but they are getting involved with sexual activity outside of sex itself that are putting them at risk. STDs are looking for sexual contact, whether you actually have sex or not, and that's an important discussion. I want to show you how bad the problem is from the Centers for Disease Control, which tracks 4 of the big STDs among young people. They have reached an all-time high for the 6th consecutive year. They are getting higher, 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 and higher. You can see chlamydia, you can see gonorrhea and syphilis. And then take a look at congenital syphilis. This is syphilis passed to newborn babies. You can see a 279% increase, over 1,800 cases and 178 deaths of babies. This should not happen. But then I want you to see the bottom of the slide. The images here show the bar graphs of the other STDs, the estimates of them. So see, CDC only tracks reportable diseases. That's chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, and HIV. But take a look at the bar graph below where you see HPV, which I will talk about, human papillomavirus, by far the most prevalent STD amongst young people today, followed then by herpes and trichomoniasis, and then you get to the other top 4, if that makes sense. I want you to know we've got a major problem with STDs and give you a little bit of understanding, again, with the hopes that you'll get go and seek a greater understanding for yourself. So let's talk about STD or STI prevalence among youth. I use those terms interchangeably: sexually transmitted disease, sexually transmitted infection. The CDC does also. The epidemic has met unprecedented increases. We saw that in the last slide. On any given day in 2018, 1 in 5 people had an STI, totaling about 68 million infections. Of the 26 million new infections in 2018, almost half of them were among youth ages 15 to 24. So for several years, we have been saying there were 20 million new infections. And in 2018, that number took a big jump to 26 million new infections. We see chlamydia, trichomoniasis, genital herpes, and HPV. Those are kind of the big 4 that are almost all of the infections. But then I don't want to miss this increase we're seeing of congenital syphilis. The highest number of congenital syphilis, babies infected with syphilis, which can affect their immune system and their eyes and even cause death. that we've ever seen reported. That one breaks my heart. So let's look at the different types of infections to give you a basic understanding of how this works. There really are two families of bacterial and viral infections. The bacterials are curable, but the damage that they've done may or may not be undone. So that's an important distinction. Viral are treatable. The symptoms can be treated, but they are not curable. You can't get rid of the virus. You can't get rid of any virus. You can't get rid of sexually transmitted viruses. So of the bacterial family, we've got chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis, primarily spread by fluids, although syphilis also has a skin component to it. Those sores on the skin, the rash on the skin can be spread as well. So it's important to know the difference between the way these are spread and the kinds of outcomes they produce. Viral are the viruses. The big ones are HIV, of course, which can lead to AIDS. HPV is human papillomavirus, can lead to genital warts and cancers. HSV, herpes simplex virus, those can cause painful sores that have this outbreak cycle. HBV, HCV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C can also lead to a liver cancer as well. There's also quite a few infections with trichomoniasis, which is a protozoan, and there's some parasites that come along as well. There's over 25 significant sexually transmitted diseases. So in kind of summary, let's think about how they affect kids today, their present impact on youth. There's a whole array of physical or pathological manifestations, things like infections or skin lesions, infections of their reproductive system and their urinary tract infection along the way. So that can happen. The emotional and mental health impact that comes along with it, I think, is also important, because it's not just getting a physical symptom or problem, it's what happens now emotionally and relationally that comes along. These can affect babies, they impact on pregnancy and the baby's transmission. And then what about the sexual partner? There's a whole issue of transmission to that person and to future people, issues with trust, and there can be relationship stress as well. That's present, but let's also look at the future impact, the longer term impact of STDs as a whole. They can lead to pelvic inflammatory diseases. It's chronic suffering from PID, which increases the risk of ectopic pregnancy, infertility, not being able to have children when you want to have children. We have various kinds of cancers that can come along from these infections, especially HPV, chronic illness, which can be continual pain and adhesions within the reproductive system. The way I explain it to young people is simply that infection in the reproductive system is creating pus or infection, which is like a glue that can kind of block things up and make things hurt and not work the way they're supposed to work. That can affect work and school, that big word incapacitation. And then there can be an impact on their relationships and their school and scholastic and academic achievement as well. So a couple of pieces of understanding I would like you to have about STDs and STIs. The first one, most of them are asymptomatic. Thanks to COVID-19, we have a pretty good understanding of what asymptomatic means. It means you have the infection, you are still contagious, but you're not manifesting any signs or symptoms. This is really important, because just because you don't feel anything or see anything doesn't mean you don't have something that could be doing damage internally to your body. And it also means that if you have it, you could be spreading it to other people without even know you have it. So we've got to talk about contraception effectiveness and ineffectiveness. So giving them a broader understanding, a lot of that is based on how is the STD transmitted? Is it through skin or is it through fluid? We were talking about pregnancy earlier. It's fairly easy to prevent pregnancy. There's a number of hormonal methods that are quite high in their effectiveness, but they provide zero protection against STDs and STIs, really. It really comes down to barrier protection, as we call it, for male and female condoms. So they've got to know the difference between risk reduction and risk avoidance. Avoidance means there is no risk. Reduction means, well, there may be less risk, but I'm still at risk for these kinds of problems, the diseases, and pregnancy as well. When we're talking about an abstinence decision, avoiding sexual activity, all sexual activity that could put us at risk is certainly a risk avoidance approach for them to know the difference too. It's not just enough to reduce it. When we're talking about optimal sexual health, we're looking at the best outcome to avoid those risks. We want to make sure we've talked about emotional and relational risks as well, that they would know there's a whole compound to this about how it affects the other people in your life. You may have heard testimonies. I've certainly heard stories before of people who brought herpes infection into their marriage and the strain relationally and emotionally on that as well. I always talk about the importance of testing and treatment for those who've been sexually active or who are sexually active. If you or someone you know has had sex before or were to get into a sexual relationship, it would be very important for them to seek out testing and treatment. The earlier treatment can reduce some of the impact of the problems that can be coming along with these diseases. So those are key topics. There's a lot to this. I hope I've piqued your interest to learn some more about this topic in particular. But what I want to take you to is what the Centers for Disease Control says about what we do about this. How do we prevent STDs among youth today when there are so many of them dealing with this problem? Well, it says right up front, abstinence. It says that the CDC tells us that the most reliable way to avoid infection is not to have sex, and that includes anal, vaginal, or oral sex. So that's a really important message that we can stand on from a health message. In families, we often talk about abstinence from a religious or a moral or maybe even a political perspective. But I want to show you that even from a health perspective, when we're looking at protecting current and future health, we can uphold the Centers for Disease Control saying abstinence is the best way to go. But then watch what it says about mutual monogamy. Mutual monogamy means that you agree to be sexually active with only one person who has agreed to be sexually active only with you, and that being in a long-term mutually monogamous relationship with an uninfected partner is one of the most reliable ways to avoid STDs. But you must both be certain you are not infected with STDs. This standard that is set here is pretty high when you translate it to our kids, right? So it talks about you're only going to have sex with that person who only agrees to have sex with you, and you're both uninfected. Well, the only way to know if you're uninfected is have you been tested, and testing is sort of complex. It's not a simple answer to get tested and you're clear. So if you've gone through all of that and agreed to only be together, to me that sounds like what most of us understand as marriage. So it speaks to that waiting for that committed, long-term, mutually monogamous relationship. Most of us know that to be marriage. And if that's your family values, you can stand on it from a health perspective around STDs also, but also around the relationship and commitment piece that is protective to where that provides that safety ground, that commitment ground of where sex can be enjoyed free of that risk of STDs. We've talked about pregnancy and STDs. I want to talk a little bit about the emotional impact of teen sexual activity. Again, a topic we could expand on if we had a lot more time, but I want you to be aware it has been proven in the research time and time and again that sex is not just about bodies. Sex is about minds and hearts. The mental and emotional impact is there. I wanted to share with you some research that was done by our Federal Department of Health and Human Services, assessing the benefits of delayed sexual activity, a synthesis of the literature. And in this comprehensive study, they found correlations between the timing of first sexual activity and a host of outcomes. So educational attainment was lower overall. Single motherhood was higher overall, more likely to happen. Poverty also more likely to happen. Depression more likely to happen. And the overall happiness in adulthood, I thought was an interesting one they found in their research. And then also went on to say delayed sexual activity improves reported relationship satisfaction for those who later marry. If we're thinking long-term in terms of marriage and family formation, we know that delaying sexual activity will improve that. Among girls, specifically, a correlation between delayed sexual activity, reducing the future chances of a first marriage ending in divorce, separation, or annulment. Delayed sexual activity increases the chances of high school graduation, and it reduces the reported symptoms of depression. There is an emotional component to this as well. This is minimized a lot in a comprehensive sex education approach that focuses on condoms and contraception and consent. We want to make sure we're also bringing to light the emotional risks of stress, anxiety, and depression that come along with sex as well. That leads to how do we protect kids from this? Well, certainly many would espouse that condoms and contraception are the way to go. And I think you're probably picking up from me that I don't think that's the best answer for our kids because there is no condoms or contraception that protects the mind and the heart. Let me show you some research from the Centers for Disease Control about condoms so that you can be armed with this information and arm your kids with it as well. I want to share with you the research from the Centers for Disease Control about condom effectiveness against STDs. So first of all, consistent and correct use of latex condoms reduces the risk for many STDs that are transmitted by genital fluids, such as chlamydia, gonorrhea, and trichomoniasis. So you'll see they're reducing the risk if transmitted by fluid. Now watch in the second statement, this changes slightly. Consistent and correct use of latex condoms reduces the risk for genital ulcer diseases, ulcers being sores on the skin, such as herpes, syphilis, and chancroid, only when the infected area or site of potential exposure is protected. So it changes, it puts a condition on the protection that it's only there if the infected area or the site of potential exposure is protected. I've helped young people understand for a long time that condoms simply don't cover all of the skin in the sexual area of the body. Third statement, though, is made. Consistent and correct use of latex condoms may reduce the risk for genital human papillomavirus infection and HPV-associated diseases like warts and cancer. Notice the shift. We went from reducing the risk for fluids, reducing the risk for ulcers or sores when the infected area is protected, and now we have may reduce the risk for HPV, which we saw earlier was by far the most common STD among young people. So this is important information for you to understand and help your children understand so they can have a full picture, as I say, informed consent about condoms. But I'll make one more click on the slide and show you that consistent and correct use leads every one of those sentences. And that's really where we get into trouble with our kids, is there's very few things that teenagers with those adolescent brains we've already been talking about, it's very difficult for them to achieve consistent and correct use every single time, following all 7 to 8 or 9 steps depending on the curriculum of how to use it correctly. So helping them understand if they're going to be sexually active, they would want to achieve this kind of protection to the best that they can to get the most risk reduction, which is still not a risk avoidance. And I think you can understand kind of where I'm going with that argument. For your information, the next slide shows some of those percentages when you kind of conglomerate up the studies, the highest level of risk reduction being HIV, a fluid disease, and then going on from there comes down with the other fluid diseases, the least amount of protection of the skin diseases. We've been talking a lot about the bad things, the harmful or dangerous things to avoid, and that certainly is a good reason to avoid sexual activity, but I think it's so much more than that. I think it's giving them a vision for marriage and family that they can seek to make decisions today that will protect them and help make those marriages and family goals even better in the future. So it's not just what we're avoiding, but what are we finding freedom to enjoy in healthy relationships and healthy decisions now that will protect and help better make our marriages and families stronger in the future. So it's not just what can go wrong, but what can go right when we make this abstinence decision and choose to wait to be sexually involved until marriage. I'm going to share with you the social ecological model that speaks to how individual, interpersonal, and environmental factors influence our behavior. And the research has been built out in this next slide, quite complex, to show you all of the factors, individual, interpersonal, and environmental, that ultimately impact the outcomes of behaviors on young people related to sex and their decisions. And what I want to zoom in on specifically are the interpersonal factors that are affected by us, the family. I want you to see the impact family has. And the way this chart worked, if there's a plus, it means it's a positive impact on the health and the behaviors of those children. If there's an M, then it means it's modifiable. It's something we can do something about in our program and you can do in your work as a family. So for a family, more connectedness to parents reported by the child, not by the parent, is absolutely a positive and it is modifiable. Parental monitoring. It's interesting. The CDC says, do you know where they are, who they're with, and what they're doing? If you can answer those 3 questions, your child is more likely to be safe in this area. Look at the third one, parental disapproval of adolescent sex. If they know you disapprove of them having sex, they're less likely to have sex. Your values really matter. Communication, are you talking about them? Absolutely protective. Living with 2 biological parents, you'll see is a positive impact, may or may not be modifiable in your situation, higher parental education, higher family income. I want you to see the research is there and then work within your family to modify and provide those protective factors that you can. You may have heard it said that a family that plays together stays together. I like to say a family that talks about sex together will stay together. If you can take this topic on, your family will be stronger and your kids will be stronger, their health better off because of it. So as I said earlier, you can do this. I also came along and said, you must do this. The danger is too great. Just like you wouldn't just set them off in your car without teaching them how and talking them about how to be safe in the car, the same is true with this very important, super sensitive, and critical topic of sex. So yes, we've called this Rock the Talk because I think you can rock the talk and be relational with them over and over and over again. Take those teachable moments and help them know your values and the very important health information that will help them succeed in this area of life. So let's close out with our homework and application for this session. Does your child know your values about sexual activity? Do they know where you stand on this subject, or have you been afraid to tell them? Don't be afraid. They want to hear what you think. Not just the information, but the values. What do you want them to do with this topic? I'll say here too, also research more about STDs. Go to cdc.gov and see what else you can learn. I've given you a little bit of the highlights there, but I think there's a lot more. A lot of us just don't understand about that particular risk area. And then I think it's helpful to get together and set some guidelines or boundaries for your home about dating. Before you're right in the middle of all of it, or even if you are, do the best that you can. But what might be some of those guidelines? Maybe we're not going to go out on a one-on-one date somewhere. Maybe we're not going to let boyfriends or girlfriends in our bedrooms. What are some of those guidelines? Talk about what's an appropriate behavior line on how far is too far, from kissing all the way down to sex. Where would you have them to start? Some good topics for discussion that I hope you'll take up with your children. Thank you for being with us as we trudge along, and I Decide for Me, Let's Talk About It Parent Webinar Series. Our next session will take on just right parenting. We'll come back to a balanced approach to parenting that helps build that connection we've seen as being very protective for our kids. Have a great evening.